Today, we are diving into one of the all-time great stories of World War II. It's got everything: a master spy, elite Siberian armies appearing out of nowhere, and the dramatic last-minute rescue of Moscow. I mean, it's a Hollywood blockbuster. But what if I told you it's not exactly true? You know, sometimes the stories we love the most, the ones we think we know inside and out, are the very ones that need a closer look. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to follow the evidence on this one and just see where it takes us. But before we get to the spy thriller, we need to talk for a second about history itself. Because it's not just a collection of facts and dates in a dusty old book. History is a story. It's a narrative we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. And like any story, it can be shaped, and sometimes it can be completely twisted. And that's where we get something called a historical myth. Now, this isn't just a simple mistake or a false story. It's way more powerful than that. It's a version of the past that's so compelling it can actually trap our understanding. It puts blinders on us and stops us from seeing the much more complex and often messier reality. So how do you build a myth like that? Well, there's often a kind of recipe. First, you just avoid the facts that don't fit the narrative you want. Just leave them out. Then, if you need to, you might fudge the evidence a bit to prove your point. And finally, this one is a classic, you accuse your enemies of doing the very things that you've done. Keep these 3 steps in your back pocket, because we're going to see them in action. Okay, now let's meet our main character. This is where the story turns into a proper spy thriller, all centered on a man who some have called one of the greatest spies of the entire 20th century. His name was Richard Sorge. Posing as a die-hard Nazi journalist in Tokyo, he worked his way into the absolute inner circle of the German embassy. He was charming, he was brilliant, and he was perfectly placed to get his hands on intelligence that could literally change the outcome of the war. And boy, was his intelligence good. Just look at this report from May of 1941. He nailed the timing of Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, almost a whole month before it happened. But here's the crazy part. His bosses in Moscow, they often just blew him off, labeling his incredibly accurate warnings as doubtful material. But the popular legend, the legend tells a much better story. It says that later that year, another of Sorge's bombshell reports, this time confirming Japan was not going to attack the Soviets, was the key piece of intel, the one that allowed Stalin to finally unleash his secret weapon, these elite, ghost-like Siberian divisions, hardened by the winter, who arrived just in the nick of time to save Moscow. This is the heart of the myth we're going to investigate. All right, let's do it. We have the legend, the dramatic story. Now it is time to check the receipts. We're going to put this whole narrative to the test by looking at the actual military records. So here's the million-dollar question, right? Is this story true? The entire legend rests on this one simple, heroic idea. Sorge's report comes in, Stalin moves the armies, and Moscow is saved. It's clean, it's powerful, it's dramatic. But is it what really happened? Okay, so this table right here, this is the evidence. This shows the actual Soviet divisions that were moved from the Far East to the West between August and December 1941. This is the critical time period. These are the only units that could possibly fit the legend. So let's take a closer look. So out of all those divisions transferred from the East, how many were actually Siberian rifle divisions sent specifically to defend Moscow? The records are pretty clear. The answer is 2. Just 2 divisions. Not vast, unending armies of Siberian super soldiers. 2. And the timeline makes it even more obvious. The decision to move most of these eastern divisions was actually made well before Sorge's famous report about Japan even arrived in October. In fact, look at this. After his intelligence landed, no new rifle divisions were shipped from the east at all. The entire premise of the legend, it just falls apart when you look at the dates. So, if it wasn't a sudden wave of Siberians, then what on earth did stop the German army, one of the most powerful military forces ever assembled, right at the gates of Moscow? Well, the real answer is a lot more complex and, honestly, way more incredible. The German advance failed because of a perfect storm of problems. Their supply lines were an absolute train wreck. The legendary General Winter showed up, first with thick mud that literally swallowed their vehicles, and then with a deep freeze that their equipment just couldn't handle. On top of that, the German high command was arrogant,
overconfident, and had terrible intelligence about just how strong the Soviets still were.
But here's the real kicker. While a few divisions were being shuffled around from the east, the Soviets were pulling off one of the biggest and fastest wartime mobilizations in human history. In the last half of 1941 alone, they raised over 400 new divisions and brigades. It wasn't a handful of elite Siberians who saved Moscow. It was a massive, desperate mobilization of ordinary Soviet citizens from all across the country.
So, this brings us all the way back to the beginning. If the evidence is so clear, why does this legend about Sorge and the Siberians stick around? Why is it still the story you see in movies and read in popular history books? Well, it's because myths are just powerful. They give us a clear hero, the master spy. They take a chaotic, messy, sprawling battle and simplify it into one single brilliant move. And for the Soviet Union, this story was pure gold as propaganda. It fit perfectly into their grand narrative of the Great Patriotic War, a heroic tale of genius, grit, and inevitable victory. Propaganda posters just like this one were absolutely key to building that great myth. They created this powerful, simple, unified image of the entire nation rising up as one to smash the invaders. And let's be honest, that's a much more inspiring story than the messy truth of logistical nightmares and desperate last-ditch mobilizations. So here it is side by side. The myth is this clean, compelling thriller about one man's genius changing the world. The reality? It's a much more complicated story about a brilliant spy whose best work was often ignored, and a victory that was won by mud, freezing weather, and the sheer overwhelming number of people mobilized to fight. And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? The stories we tell about our past aren't really just about the past. They're about who we are now. The Sorge myth served a huge purpose for the Soviet Union. It helped build a particular vision of their glorious past. And really, every country, every culture does this in its own way. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. The story of Richard Sorge and the Siberians is this incredible reminder that history isn't set in stone. It's a living thing, and it's always open to being questioned, which really makes you wonder, what other great stories, what other facts that we all take for granted might just be really, really good stories